Good morning. Good to see all of you this morning. As you know, I typically base my chapel talks on a question that has come to me from someone at some time, and that will be true this morning as well. However, usually I'm responding to a question from somebody who is at Gordon, sometimes one of my students or from a member of the faculty or staff. But not this time. In fact, this question came from someone totally unconnected with Gordon. He was a president of another college, and someone that I met at a CIC conference where college presidents from all over the country come to learn from one another. It's a good conference usually, and certainly that was the case this time around. Until, that is, I got into this conversation with this fellow that I didn't really know. In fact, we just happened to be sitting next to one another at one of the sessions, and we got to talking about a number of things. Eventually, he noted from my name tag that I was from Gordon, and then he asked me if I knew Judd Carlberg. I said, well, yes, actually rather well. In fact, I've known Judd and Jan for over 30 years. He looked at me, and then he said, kind of pausing, with a little bit of a wince, what do you think of him? Judd, that is. What kind of president is he? And he said it in this odd sort of way that made me wonder whether he was fishing for an insult or something. You know, one of those moments when if you said, oh, he's a complete turkey, the other person would smile broadly and say, I thought so. But I didn't say that, of course. Couldn't say that. And so I let go with a comment that must have sounded like a shot between the eyes. I think he's one of the most amazing, gifted individuals that I've ever met in my life. And then I stopped. And I looked at him to see whether he was still alive. Much to my relief, he suddenly broke into a huge smile and said, me too, me too. After which we continued the conversation for some time, actually, sharing some of our varied thoughts and observations on both Judd and Jan, and confirming for me once again my own conclusions after working with these two people through all these years. And why would that be? Why have I reached that conclusion, for one thing? But what makes Jan and Judd who they are, the people they are, the gift they are and have been to Gordon all these years? That's the question of the morning in some ways. And it's not quite as easy a question as you might think. In fact, there are all kinds of reasons why I might not have reached that conclusion under normal circumstances. Personality differences, for one thing. Judd and I are very different kinds of people. I'm on the intuitive, somewhat idealistic, empathetic, maybe even pathetic side of the personality scale. And Judd, well, Judd is not. He's a straight shooter who sees things as they are, not how we might want them to be, and makes decisions accordingly. These are actually very good traits, as we will see in a moment. But they're not the things that we empathetic types typically like. In fact, they kind of make us mad or sad or send us running in another direction. But that didn't happen with Judd and me. And that's what makes this story unusual. Actually, there are other reasons why this friendship shouldn't have matured as it did. One of them being that I haven't always been the easiest person to live with over the years. When Judd was academic dean, for example, I had the very bad habit of telling him what I thought about all kinds of things that he probably didn't want to hear, shouldn't have heard. Worse than that, when he became president and then made the mistake of asking me to be his provost, do you know what I did? I said, yes, I thank you very much. But then, after only 3 years on the job, when I was still getting my feet wet, I said, so long, I'm leaving, and went off to become provost at this school in Santa Barbara, of all things, called Westmont. which of course we both knew well since I graduated from there, and it is a sister college in the Christian College Consortium, and in some ways as close to Gordon as any other school in the country. But that, of course, raises the question, why? Why would someone take the same job there that they had here? Especially given the fact that we had been here for 2 decades, loved New England, raised our kids here, and frankly, just started this provost job that Judd had so graciously given me a few years before. Those are just some of the questions that Judd could have asked me at the time, and rightly so. But he did not. And now we get to one of those characteristics about Dr. Carlberg that I think makes him so amazing as a leader. Because when I told him of my decision to leave, do you know what he said? He looked at me and listened, actually listened to all my reasons for making the move, and then said, how can we make this move as good as possible for you, for Gordon, and for Westmont? And we immediately began laying plans for making the whole thing work. And not just work for Gordon, but for us as well. Stan and Judy, these traitors, these so-called friends who were now leaving 2 gaping holes in the administration because Judy was the registrar at the time. But that didn't matter. What mattered to Judd was realistically facing the situation before him and doing the best he could for all concerned. And that's something that I have seen this man do time and time again, and almost always with the same results, which are what? Well, in this case, he then went off and did a national search for the next provost and wound up hiring Mark Sargent, who I can honestly tell you, as someone who has watched Mark over the years, is far and away one of the best provosts I've ever seen, ever. I mean, what ended up happening at Gordon when I left is that Gordon won big time, because Gordon wound up replacing a so-so provost, that would be me, with the best provost in the history of the human race, that would be Mark. Amazing. Amazing how well it turned out for all concerned, for Gordon, for Judd, and even for us, since I think making that transition was the right thing for us as well. But no one would have known that at that moment when I told Judd that we were leaving. At that point, the situation excuse me, looked awful. And Judd had reasons to be mad at me, at us, at the situation. But that's not what he did. That's not what he does, in fact. What he does is the right thing not just for himself at the immediate moment, but the right thing for all concerned. For us, the troublemakers, for Gordon, where the trouble existed, and for the kingdom, which is the only thing that matters. You see, why would someone do such a thing? Why would Judd respond as he did? In retrospect, of course, everything seemed to turn out dandy, but at the time it happened, that's not what we would have thought, except Judd, who thought differently, who thought about the big picture, who thought not about his own hurt, but his own task, his own responsibility, and wound up making the most of it, something that he has done now time and time again. That's Judd, you see. That's what the rest of us should be like as well. But it is not. And the question again is why? Why is Judd like he is? And why are the rest of us, most of the time, not like him, like me? That part's easy, actually. We're not like that because we're a bunch of dolts pursuing our own interests and making a mess of things in the process. But not both for ourselves and for others. But why is he the way he is and has been during all these years serving Gordon? That's the real question. And it's an important question because the fact is, whatever it is that has allowed him to live his life this way, it has had tremendous effects. Gordon, for one thing, has hugely benefited from the gifts and wisdom of this man over the years. I mean, just stand someplace on this campus sometime, almost any place, and look around. A good number of the buildings you see were built during his leadership. It is no exaggeration to say that this campus was absolutely transformed during his presidency. But so was I. In fact, I'd say that I've learned as much from Judd and Jan as any two people that I've ever known in my life. And that, by the way, is the truth. They have been good friends, to be sure, but they have been more than that. They have been my teachers as well. So let me tell you what I've learned from Judd and Jan, just a few things that they have taught me over the years. And then maybe after all that, we'll figure out why. Okay, here's number one. First thing. It takes a team, and it starts at home. It takes a team, and it starts at home. Here's something you'll realize pretty quickly after meeting Jan and Judd. They both understand their limits, and they're totally honest about those limitations with themselves and with others. This isn't false humility, by the way, it's honesty. They know their gifts, but they understand as well where they are needy. And for that reason, they rely upon others to get a lot of the work done. I think this comes out most especially, by the way, in their relationship with one another. They rely on each other all the time. In fact, I don't know that I've seen a better team in all my life than Jan and Judd. And it works. This team works because they're different. And they know it. They love it, in fact. And they use their differences to be better, much better than they could ever be alone. Jan can tell a story, for example, like few people in the history of the human race. Judd, on the other hand, can tell you what it means. Not just up here in the clouds, but down here where we live. For the story, go to Jan. For the practical implication, Judd's your man. Jan can also tell you who's hurting, who's having a hard time, and why. Judd, on the other hand, is often rather surprised by that fact. You mean Billy isn't having the time of his life? No, Judd, he's not. But Judd will take that information and figure out what to do about it, whether to let Billy work it out for himself or to intervene, to help Billy as well as those with whom he's working, for their benefit and for the good of Gordon as well. And I've seen this kind of thing happen over and over again, sometimes personally, sometimes with others. And the question again is why? Why are they able to do it? And to be honest with you, I think the answer is actually kind of simple. It's because they are strong. Very, very strong. There are two possible responses when someone close to you sees something that you don't see. The first is the natural one. You're wrong. I don't see it, so it must not be there. Leave me alone. The second is the very unnatural one. You know, I may be wrong. The fact is, she sees things that I don't see. And if that's the case, what should we do about it? And that's how these two people work with each other. I've seen it over and over again. And why? Why are they able to do that? Well, it's because they're strong. They're strong precisely because they know where they're weak. And such strength only comes from one place. It cometh from the Lord. They know who's really in charge, in other words, which is why they have the strength to listen. So number one, they're a team. But there's a second which goes with it, and it is this. Difficult days aren't there to send you running. They're there to teach you. Difficult days aren't there to send you running. They're there to teach you. Some Christians think that bad days mean that you're not in the Lord's will. You know, the Lord isn't blessing me, so I must not be in the right spot. I need to go someplace else, do something else. Got to get out of here. And sometimes that is right. There are moments when it is time to get going. But often, indeed, I think most of the time, it's not right. Rather, they are there for other reasons, one of which is to teach you a lesson. And Judd knows that. In fact, that's the way he responds to almost every problem that comes his way. What's happening? And what can we learn from it? Those two questions are Judd's modus operandi, two questions he asks all the time, which tells you, by the way, why he's such a successful college president. Because he's a student, first and foremost, a learner, the learner in chief, you might call him. As a result, he doesn't run from things, he learns from things. I can't tell you how many times over the years that Judd has told me, Stan, X, Y, and Z is going to happen. It's happening already, I can see it. And then after he says that, I'll say, no, Judd, it's not going to happen, in which case I'll be wrong. Or I'll say, you're absolutely right, Judd, we'd better get out of town, in which case I'll run and he'll remain doing what needs to be done to prepare for what he saw coming. It's happened a million times. And the reason isn't just because Judd is so smart, which he is, it's because he's so honest. Honest with himself and honest about what he sees around him. And then after that, wise enough and brave enough to confront whatever he's seeing and do what needs to be done. Whether it's popular or not, whether it's understood or not, whether it means changing or not changing, leaving the past behind or rooting oneself in that past so that it can guide your future. And why can he do this? Again, because he's a student. He's one of you. And he knows that difficult days, like a difficult course, isn't there to send you running. It's there to teach you. It is for your good. That is, if you're a learner, which he is. Which gets us to number 3. Organization is where you start, not end. Organization is where you start, not end. And with this third lesson, we move pretty much exclusively to Judd, not Jan. Regarding the first 2 lessons about teamwork and handling difficulties, they are together. But on the issue of organization, well, they're a little different. At least they started out differently. Judd, of course, is a born organizer. Jan, however, was born, shall we say, less organized. But hold that thought for a moment. We'll come back to it. For now, I want to think about just Judd. When I first met Judd, I pretty much concluded that he was one of the most organized fellows that I ever met in my life, which he is. What I didn't realize until later, however, is that he is organized for a reason. And the reason isn't to be organized. It is to accomplish that which needs to be done. He organizes for the task, in other words, but the task isn't just to be organized. And you know how you can figure out the difference? Here's the key. The person who organizes for the task can change direction if needed. But the person who thinks that the task is organization just keeps going with the same organization, come hell or high water. And that's not Judd. Judd's not interested in hell, for one thing. He wants the higher road. And if taking that higher road means reorganizing, so be it. Like every other president, Judd has faced many, many difficult moments in his presidency. That's what presidents do. But what I have noticed time and time again is his willingness to think outside the box on the how-to question and to reorganize in order to face the problem squarely. In fact, one thing you'll notice is that Judd is very creative with people. He's got folks on his staff who have been with him many years but have done any number of different things depending upon what needs doing. Take my wife, for example. I told you that Judy was the registrar at Gordon before we shuffled off to the West Coast. But do you know what she was doing before that? She was Judd's assistant in the academic dean's office when he was vice president for academic affairs. But then something awful happened. Florence Windsor, who was the registrar at that time, decided to retire. Good for her, perhaps, but awful for Gordon, because she left this huge hole in that office, which everyone thought would need to be filled by someone who already had lots of experience in the registrar's office. And that's what's often done. You know, you find somebody who's had a lot of experience and bring them in, fill the job. But Judd doesn't always do what's often done. He observes instead and learns. And in this case, his observations had led him to notice something about his assistant, that she was almost as organized as he was, for one thing, but cared deeply about doing things right. And so one day, when he was tired and not thinking too clearly, he had this sudden brainstorm that maybe Judy, his assistant, could be the next registrar, which she would, as we would learn down the road once she took the job. But we were not down the road yet. At that point, we didn't even know the road existed. And so the question is, how did he come up with this idea in the first place, that Judy would be a good registrar? It wasn't the easiest conclusion for him to reach organizationally speaking, because he would lose his own assistant in the process, the one who kept him organized. And it wasn't the easiest for the registrar's office either, since they would have to train this novice to be the registrar. Judy didn't know beans about the job. And yet, it happened for the good of the college, I believe. Why? Because the point of organization for Judd isn't about holding on to something, it's about accomplishing something. And that's what he does all the time. And so does Jan, by the way. Even though she's not quite so well organized, or didn't used to be at least, but she is something else, as we all know, and that is creative, like few people I've ever known. But creative, it turns out, for the exact same reason that her husband is organized. Judd is organized for the task, remember, not for the sake of organization. And Jan is creative for a higher purpose, not simply for the sake of creativity. Which takes us to number 4, and it is this: a good story is worth 1,000 words. A good story is worth 1,000 words. Not a new thought, of course. And you're thinking, yeah, you just say that because you like to tell stories all the time, which is true, but I didn't always. In fact, if you ask my brother or sister or my friends growing up, was Stan a storyteller in his youth, they would say, no, not that I remember, and for good reason. I was not. Actually, I liked a good story, but only if it ended up with a joke. And my reading habits growing up were almost totally consumed by nonfiction. A good story was sort of a waste of time, or so I thought. But 2 things changed that, actually 3. Eventually, of course, a good liberal arts education forces you to encounter some good stories, and that happened to me as an undergraduate. But secondly, as you know, I became a professor here at Gordon. And it eventually became clear to me that I could talk about social theory, which I love. I could talk about that till the cows came home, but if I didn't tell a story or 2, the cows would be the only ones coming home, because my students would not. They would remain out to pasture, looking for more flavorful cuisine, of which there is much at Gordon. But there was one more thing that turned me around on this whole business of storytelling, and that was Jan Carlberg, who of course can tell a good story about as well as anyone on earth, which impressed me from day one. But there was more, much more actually, because it turns out that stories, good ones at least, are not simply a matter of employing a technique to hold someone's attention. Indeed, stories are first off about paying attention. They result from looking, listening, and learning. And so you note that most of Jan's stories are about things that have happened in her own world, in her own family, in her experience growing up, or experience of those she loves. Jan doesn't just tell stories, in other words. She learns from the stories that she sees all around her, and then shares her learning with us. Which means what? Well, it means that her stories exist not merely for the sake of the story itself. They are attention-grabbing, to be sure. But long before they grabbed our attention, they grabbed hers. She learned first, and then so did we. Stories for Jan are vehicles for learning, exactly like her husband's approach to organization, you might recall, and exactly what we're about at this Christian liberal arts college. Jan and Judd pay attention. That's the point. And it is amazing what you can learn if you pay attention. Little things that you would hardly even notice in the routine of life can suddenly give you an education. Actually, I'm reminded right now of one of those little things that happened to us a few years ago at Christmas, partly, no doubt, because it strikes me as one of those things that Jan would notice and pass along to the rest of us for our edification. But now it's my turn. Again, this was just a little thing, just your normal, everyday happening, which we've been doing at my family ever since my youth. You probably do it as well. And that is gathering around the table as you get ready to eat your Christmas meal and praying, thanking the Lord for what he has given us, and most especially at Christmas, the gift of his Son. We actually do lots of eating at Christmas, so this gives us plenty of opportunity to pray. There's the Christmas Eve meal, which for many years has been fondue, and then there's Christmas morning, which is my responsibility primarily, and includes the best Eggs Benedict that you've ever tasted in your life, so I think. And then finally on Christmas afternoon, after all the presents have been opened and everyone is totally exhausted from unwrapping those packages that you spent days wrapping in the first place, the magnum opus, the big turkey, the final meal at Christmas. Well, on this occasion, we were sitting around the table looking at the big turkey, which was kind of staring us in the face, sort of like the Peking duck in the Christmas Story, if you remember that one. Anyway, but we couldn't eat it, of course. We had to pray first. And in our family, that means reaching out and holding hands with the people who are sitting next to you. Judy came up with this idea years ago, and the rest of us have put up with it ever since, even though about half the time I wind up sticking my elbows in the salad and then wonder what's tickling me halfway through the prayer. Anyway, this time the table had a few more people sitting around it than normal. For in addition to the normal tribe, that being Judy and our 3 children plus their spouses, we had a new member of the family, our first grandchild, Max. Max was still using the high chair at the time, which was nicely stationed right between me and his mom. That would be Heather, our oldest daughter. That was a good place for him, at least I thought, so I could tease him periodically, as I'm inclined to do, and his mom could keep both of us under control, as she's inclined to do. Anyway, as we prepared to pray, Heather and I reached out to hold Max's hand, as was required by law. The problem was, Max was already intently looking at his food right in front of him, and he wanted no part in holding hands with such a tempting display of goodies right in front of him. So Heather, being a smart mom, said, "Fine," and reached across to hold my hand instead. Just like the good old days, I thought to myself. As we bowed our heads, however, Max looked at his food and then looked up at his mom and changed his mind. Figured out what he really valued, you might say, what was really important to him. And so he stretched out his hand and opened his palm to his mother. And Heather, well, she did the right thing. She let go of my hand and clasped the hand of her son instead. It was a nothing event in the eyes of the world, but to the eyes of the beholder, that would be me. It was the world as it should be. Our first child, a child whom we had been given, letting go of my hand so that she could give her hand to another. That's what we're here for. Did you know that? Not to have babies necessarily. Some will be given children, some will not. But all of us will be given to each other, to lift one another up, to nourish one another, to teach one another, and to grow one another in the wisdom that God has so generously bestowed on us. That is what Judd and Jan have done for us here at Gordon College, by the way. They have reached out their hands to us in far too many ways to even count, so that we might learn and grow into the people that God has created us to be. That's why they're a team, in good days and bad. That's why they organize and tell marvelous stories. They weren't put here for themselves, you see, and they know it. They were put here for us, to equip us, to help us to continue the journey so that we might one day do precisely what they have already done, which is to reach out to others as they have reached out to us, passing along the truth we know, not only by what we say, but how we live. And what is the truth? What is the thing that has allowed them to give of themselves to us over all these years? And now, let us go so that we can give ourselves to others? Well, we know the answer, don't we? It is the truth we read just a few minutes ago, a truth upon which this college was established by another servant named Judson, a truth that allows us to give that which we have been given, love as we have been loved, and live as we have been designed to live by the one with whom we will live forever. The Lord is God. That is the truth. He made us and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. That is why we enter his gates with thanksgiving and go into his courts with praise. Because this we know in good times or in bad, at the height of the mountain or in the valley, whether holding hands or giving our hand to another, the Lord is good. His unfailing love endures forever, and his faithfulness to each generation. Thank you, Judd and Jan, for living the truth among us. We shall not forget. Thanks be to God.